Hello, in this video, I want to continue to talk about some of the stuff that we've been thinking about before in terms of Moten and the workers' strike. If you haven't, I would definitely tune into the last two videos that I did. The first one, which was the intro to workers' strike and Moten, which is kind of just like some background, what I think are some of the most important arguments from Fred Moten and Stefano Harney concerning like the workers' strike resolution and what I think are kind of like the central critiques that we'll be taking up when reading their literature in order to consider like how can we basically think of a differential resistance movement and why is the state recognition of the workers' strike movement kind of like problematic. And in the second video, I kind of did the first part to this video, which is just like how can we apply this as a criticism to like some of the policy affirmatives that could be read on the upcoming resolution, and what kind of like general ideas do we have for like the framing and thesis concern that will kind of like frame a lot of the concerns that we'll be talking about in this video when really considering like things like the link, the thesis debate, impact comparison, and alternative debating. I think that if this is kind of your first time really thinking about Moten either as a negative strategy or just Moten as something that's like really core to a resolution, and you're kind of having a hard time figuring out where this particular lecture is going, then I would definitely look at the other ones to give a little bit more context to the stuff that I'll be doing here, because I definitely think it's helpful to see it more as like a continuance of lectures than just kind of like see it as like discontinued videos that you're kind of just like clicking between, because I think the progression kind of helps the conversation develop and stuff like that. So in terms of this video specifically, the place that I really want to start is continuing from the last video in terms of talking about like how do we apply some of the framing and thesis concerns to the link debate. As you'll see, as some of the stuff that I'll say in a lot of the videos that I do kind of covering various criticisms, I think that the framing and thesis portions are really important for basically setting a standard for what type of link arguments are necessary for you to kind of like win debate, and what is the threshold for like how like what types of impacts the links need to trigger in order for you to be able to like win the debate because of the way that you're framing it. And so I think that when we kind of like use the policy v planning framework that we talked a lot about in the last video, there are a lot of really interesting ways that you're kind of like really set in stone about like what link argument you're already making. I feel like the reason why the critique that Moten and Harney are making is so good on this particular resolution is because I feel like at a top level, your framing and thesis concerns, if you win them, are straight up no's to like the core thesis value of the affirmative, which is like is a recognition of a workers' strike good. And I feel like if you're able to make this argument about policy and planning and the way in which planning tries to consume the way that policy tries to consume planning, then you already at a thesis level basically have this like core kind of like say no to the plan type of argument just in its own kind of like vacuum, because the value of that statement is robbed by the kind of like subsumption that planning takes up, right? And so I think that a lot of the arguments that teams would kind of make outside of that are just ways in which the kind of like movements are able to create their own forms of resistance and are able to have like independence and agency in the way in which they promote like various sources of resistance. And I feel like one that's kind of like not that there are definitely ways for you to really answer that concern and make it a lot easier in terms of being able to win that like there's like no historical precedent for why these types of movements wouldn't be able to be influenced by the state in a variety of ways, especially when it comes to like things like access to funding and stuff like that. But also like when you're asking a question of kind of like what does it look like to find links outside of just that primary concern, I feel like a lot of the advantages that kind of like have to be read are just about either the material gains of like what that would do to create like just a better community, a better society that is like more equitable and has more rights for workers, like decrease in wage gaps, etc. But also arguments about the way in which it kind of like sets a model for how like other places around the world should deal with like resistance and should deal with kind of like the like democracy as this kind of like self-correcting thing. And I think that a lot of the arguments that should kind of like be strongly pushed on this kind of resolution in the case of that is the way in which that kind of proves how the relationship that we have to resistance movements becomes like this pamphlet in which the world order or in which the international kind of order becomes organized around. And that kind of like modeling is the ability to create a pamphlet for how you're able to basically passively decide what types of movements are recognizable or not. I think this is why like you basically need to get an argument about like how there's always kind of a limit to like what institutionality can produce because of the ways in which like what we have to do to like clearly define things like what a worker strike is and like what counts as striking versus what counts as like violent protesting, right? And all of these things kind of like set barriers that make it harder for us to think about how much resistance is actually included in such an idea. And I think that this kind of like the limit to institutionality is that there inevitably has to be something that the law is able to like limit out as like out of bounds or not good in order for it to be like protecting the value of something else. And so in order to sustain the value of what the right to worker strike means, it has to kind of like push out and make seem dangerous, seem violent the idea of type of resistance that looks something other than the strike, right? I think that this is why like arguments like the permutation don't really fly for a lot of affirmative teams against a criticism like this, because I feel like you have so many good arguments to make about why the kind of like core thesis values of subsumption really make the permutation outright look like the same type of process, that the way in which they are kind of like taking up and thinking through the ideas for what types of the kind of idea for like what types of relationship movements that are outside of the defining factors of what a worker strike is could have towards the state, and this kind of like slow inclusion of them is the defanging that has kind of like historically taken place. And I feel like a lot of various types of examples, whether you're talking about like the Black Panther Party, where you're talking about the Zapatistas, etc. And I feel like there are a lot of ways in which you can pull various historical examples to show how this process of recognition turns into one in which like these movements are basically mimicking the violence and kind of like the structure of the state at an institutional level, making it harder to think about like a kind of like revolutionary outside to that. And I think that this means that when you get down to like the impact comparison against a lot of soft left teams, I feel like you can make this kind of like inevitability argument that's really hard to beat about how the kind of conditions of like capitalism, anti-blackness, settler colonial dispossession, etc. continue under the frame of these kind of like softest, like basically non-foundational or non-structural kind of like resistance paths towards the state. And I feel like against a lot of the harder left teams, I feel like really going down the path of just being like it is impossible for us to think about like what resistance like recognition looks like when we continue to live on the unethical grounds of such recognitions is a really good line to kind of like stand on in terms of why you're able to win arguments like rev suicide, why you're able to win arguments like we should just have kind of this like infinite refusal of the values of what that subsumption looks like in the way that it's able to generate like similar forms of structural violence in different avenues that don't allow the room for things like a different type of protest, etc. And I think that means when you really get to the alternative debate, you have a lot of options to work off, whether it's just making an argument about why you should refuse like subsumption or refuse the ability to be consumed by the process of planning that by the process of policy that the 1AC is taking up, or if you want to kind of like offer an alternative that's a question of like how do we do planning differently, right? What does it look like for us to think about fugitivity and incommensurability as different terms for being able to kind of like refuse the question of like recognition and whether or not its terms allow us to adequately to kind of like assert ourselves as agents, as in kind of like resistance and in alliance with each other, etc. And I think that those are really interesting places to kind of like start your analysis and be able to build a really strong negative argument out of Moten and Hardy's stuff overall. So hopefully this video was helpful, and hopefully you'll keep tuning into more. Thanks.